Content warning. The report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Rights legislation. Activists fought for civil rights. White Americans reacted with violence after the end of Reconstruction. African Americans, facing increased threats to their liberty, organized and mobilized to assert their equal rights. Like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, used protest and litigation to advance the civil rights of African Americans and secure the rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments. In 1931, much of the NAACP's legal work focused on defending African Americans from wrongful convictions and bringing lawsuits to hold white perpetrators of racial terror accountable for their crimes. In 1932, the NAACP also brought legal challenges to end many of the devices states used to suppress black political power, such as the all-white primary. 1933. These efforts, NAACP lawyers played a critical role in using litigation to end racial segregation, most famously through Brown v. Board of Education, where the NAACP convinced the U.S. court to strike down racial segregation in public schools as unconstitutional. 334. In addition to its litigation, the organization lobbied the federal government to enact civil rights legislation, including anti-lynching laws, voting rights laws, and other laws that would ensure the equal protection of African Americans. 335. 2. Played a critical role in early black activism. In the 1896 election in North Carolina, for instance, Sarah Dudley Petty canvassed the black sections of Raleigh to urge black women to persuade their husbands, brothers, and sons to vote. 136. In 1898, the Organization of Colored Ladies in Wilmington declared that for every Negro who refuses to register his name a vote, we shall make it our business to deal with him in a way that will not be pleasant. He shall be branded a white-livered coward who would sell his liberty. 337. The United States ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920. Black women registered in large numbers to vote. In 1938, for instance, in Cook County, Delaware, one local paper reported unusually large numbers of black women who showed up to vote, though officials would prevent many of them, and many others across the country, from voting. 339. Who contributed to a surge in black civil rights activism. 40. The service and sacrifice of African Americans, both abroad in the military and at home in factories and fields, underscored the moral imperative for equal treatment, especially given America's war against the Nazism and white supremacy abroad. 341. Energy, black organizations pushed to secure voting rights, continuing efforts to organize, educate, and register black voters, despite the threats of violence and the other barriers that states had created after Reconstruction. 42. Black women like Ella Baker led and directed civil rights campaigns and voter registration drives for some of the nation's largest civil rights groups, including the NAACP, Southern Leadership Conference, and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. 343. In addition, interracial labor unions in the South played a part in registering black voters. 44. In 1947, Local 22 of the Food and Tobacco Workers in Winston-Salem, North Carolina helped register 3,000 black residents in the city, helping elect the first black alderman to the city's board since Reconstruction. 345. Veterans demanding equal treatment returned home to fierce resistance. 146. In Decatur, Mississippi, a white senator, Senator Theodore Bilbo, warned black residents to stay away from the polls for the Democratic primary in 1946, calling for every red-blooded white man to use any means to keep the niggers away from the polls. 347. White people waving pistols turned 5 returning World War II veterans away from voting during that primary. 348. A group of civil rights organizations complained to the U.S. about Senator Bilbo's intimidation tactics, prompting a Senate committee to hold 4 days of hearings in Jackson, Mississippi. 49. 200 African Americans, most of them veterans, packed the federal courtroom in Jackson to share their experience of violence and voter suppression. 350. Americans face similar threats in other places. In March 1948, the Ku Klux Klan paraded around Wrightsville, Georgia, warning that blood would flow if blacks tried to vote in the forthcoming election. In 51, 7 months later, two whites threatened Isaac Nixon, a black veteran, telling him not to vote. 352 he refused to heed their warning, cast his ballot shortly after. And by nightfall he had been murdered. 353, though Nixon's murderers later stood trial, an all-white jury acquitted them. 354. On the Christmas Eve of 1951, the KKK bombed the home of the state's NAACP director, murdering Harry T. and his wife. 355 during the 1963 civil rights protests in Birmingham, Alabama, white policemen and firefighters unleashed hounds and blasted protesters with high-pressure water hoses that stripped the clothes off their backs. 356. In Wood, Mississippi, white citizens and officials responded to black voter registration efforts by cutting off food supply to black communities, imprisoning black people for breach of peace, setting fire to black businesses, and firing gunshots at black activists from their cars and their homes. 357 when black activists organized the Freedom Vote and the Freedom Summer of 1964 in Mississippi, 358 local sheriffs arrested 3 activists and turned them over to KKK members, who proceeded to murder the activists, burn their car, and bury their remains. 359. 1965, future Congressman John Lewis led some 600 protesters on a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. 360 that bloody Sunday, Alabama state troopers attacked. 161 awaiting the protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers rushed into the crowd with nightsticks. 62 troopers beat and bloodied protesters, knocking many unconscious. 363 troopers fractured Lewis's skull in the assault. 364 I thought I was going to die on that bridge, he later recalled. 365 the bloodshed at Selma prompted outrage across the nation, becoming the point that spurred the federal government to enact the Voting Rights Act that year. 366. Rights Act of 1965. Long black struggle for freedom led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, a landmark law that prohibited many of the barriers described in this chapter, allowing millions of African Americans to vote. 367 in 1964, prior to the protections of the Voting Rights Act. 57. Eligible African Americans remained unregistered to vote. 8. The passage of the Voting Rights Act resulted in a 21% increase in black voter registration. The largest gains were recorded in the South, where the percentage of registered black voters increased from below 31% to over 66% by 1984. 369. The Voting Rights Act empowered the United States Department of Justice to enforce voting rights, authorize individual voters to sue in federal court to enforce their voting rights, and authorized the federal government to send examiners to register voters. 170 among the Act's most important provisions. The Voting Rights Act prohibits any voting restriction that results in the denial of the right to vote on race, regardless of whether a state intended to discriminate. 371. Section 4 of the law identified certain state and local governments that had a history of discrimination against African Americans. State and local entities that demonstrated such past discrimination were covered jurisdictions, subject to greater oversight from the federal government. 372 and 5 provided that covered jurisdictions were required to obtain approval, or preclearance, from the Department of Justice or a federal court in Washington, D.C. for passing any voting rights-related law. The covered jurisdiction had to demonstrate that the proposed voting change did not have a discriminatory purpose or a discriminatory effect on black or other non-white voters. 373. Black activists organized the Freedom Vote and the Freedom Summer of 1964 in Mississippi. Local sheriffs arrested 3 activists and turned them over to KKK members, who proceeded to murder the activists, burn their car, and bury their remains. Together, these provisions represented what the United States Department of Justice called the most successful piece of civil rights legislation ever adopted by the United States Congress, in eliminating many of the devices that had been used to deny Americans their right to vote. 374. The last decade, however, the United States Supreme Court has removed or weakened key pillars of the Voting Rights Act. 375 in Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4 of the Act as unconstitutional. In 76, and because Section 5 single quote S preclearance requirements only applied to areas identified through Section 4, the Supreme Court effectively eliminated Section 5 as well. Admitting that voting discrimination still exists, the court felt that enough had been done because 40 years had passed and minority voting rates had improved. 377. The court found Section 4 to no longer be necessary. Despite Congress's renewal of Section 4 in 2006 by an overwhelming majority, the House voted 390 in favor to 33 opposed. The Senate passed it unanimously. Despite Congress's finding that 40 years has not been a sufficient amount of time to eliminate the vestiges of discrimination following nearly 100 years of disregard for the dictates of the 15th Amendment, 378 the court's decision prompted Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to protest and dissent that striking down this provision of the Voting Rights Act when it has worked and is continuing to work is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. 379. The court weakened Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as well. 180 Though Section 2 prohibits any voting law that results in the denial of voting rights based on race, the court, in Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee, rewrote the law to limit its reach. 181 While Section 2 speaks only to voters' rights and the need to protect them against racial discrimination, the Supreme Court created a new requirement for courts to consider the strength of the state interests. 182 By inserting the state's goals into the equation, the Supreme Court the Voting Rights Act from a Civil Rights Act into a balancing act, allowing voting rights to be sacrificed if the court believed the state's goals to be worthy enough. 383. Court also declared that the legality of a voting restriction should be evaluated partly based on whether the law has a long pedigree or was in widespread use as of 1982, the year Congress amended the Voting Rights. Prohibit laws that result in racially discriminatory denials of the right to vote. 184 But, as detailed in this chapter, many racially discriminatory voting restrictions have had a long and widespread pedigree in this nation's history. Poll taxes and literacy tests existed for almost 100 years, some restrictions even longer. 85 By considering a voting restrictions used in the past as a basis for accepting it, the Supreme Court's decision enables discriminatory restrictions to remain in place, simply because they had been used previously. Supreme Court's elimination or weakening of the anti-discrimination protections in Sections 2, 4, and 5 of the Voting Rights Act has opened the floodgates for laws restricting voter access across the nation. After the Shelby County v. Texas implemented a strict photo ID law that had previously been rejected under Section 5. 386. The North Carolina legislature also passed a sweeping law that instituted a stringent photo ID requirement, eliminated same-day voting registration, and cut back on early voting. 187 Over the 4 years following Shelby County, jurisdictions previously covered under Section 5 closed 1,173 polling places, many in districts with majority Latino and Black voters. 188 states also limited voting hours, limited the ability to vote via mail-in ballots, and purged voter registration rolls. 389. Restrictions limited voting access for all Americans. They also targeted or specially affected African Americans. Full of polling places in Ohio ensured that African Americans in Ohio wait in line for 52 minutes to vote, while whites wait only 18 minutes. 390 After record turnout of Black voters in Georgia helped flip federal elections in favor. In 2020, Georgia's Republican state legislature passed a law limiting drop boxes for mail ballots, introducing more rigid voter identification requirements for absentee ballots, and criminalizing the act of providing food or water to people waiting in line to vote. 91 In a recent lawsuit filed in federal court, the U.S. Department of Justice asserts that Georgia enacted these restrictions specifically to target Black voters. 392. The last decade, however, the United States Supreme Court has removed or weakened key pillars of the Voting Rights Act. In Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4 of the Act constitutional. For all, states across the country introduced 389 restrictive voting laws from January to May 2021 alone. 393 With the Supreme Court's recent limitations of the Voting Rights Act, laws like Georgia's are becoming the new norm across the country. 394. California. Half of the 20th century, California began taking steps to expand voting access. California encouraged county and volunteer voting registration efforts in the 1950s and 1960s, and it amended its constitution to eliminate its literacy test in 1970. 395 In the 1970s, California relaxed its rules for requesting absentee ballots and for remaining on the voter registries from year to year. 396 More recently, the state enacted the California Voting Rights Act in 2001, which permits citizens to file suit in state court to challenge racially discriminatory restrictions in at-large elections without having to straight the higher evidentiary standards required under the Federal Voting Rights Act. 397. Efforts to advance voting access. The federal government has observed that California and some of its cities and counties have continued to engage in voting discrimination throughout the late 20th century. Attorney General determined that California's use of a statewide literacy test to restrict voting during the November 1968 election violated the Federal Voting Rights Act. 398. 68 to 1976, the United States Department of Justice also identified Kings County, Monterey County, and Yuba County as engaging in discriminatory practices in these counties and objecting to various new voting restrictions proposed by these counties well into the 2000s. 199 as another example, the United States Department of Justice objected to Merced County's redistricting plan in 1992, a plan opposed by both Black and Latino communities, because it would have denied them the opportunity to elect their preferred candidate. Thus, while California has enacted laws expanding voting rights, equal access to the ballot box continues to be an ongoing challenge in parts of the state. Effects of restrictions on Black political participation. Voting Rights Act of 1965. When adopting the numerous voting restrictions described in this chapter, states made their intent clear. New Senator explained, these restrictions were meant to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action under the limitations of the federal Constitution, with a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of, legally. Comparing the numerical strength of the white electorate, 401. It's proved effective. Louisiana adopted a number of these restrictive rules in its 1898 Constitution. The numbers in Louisiana plummeted from 130,000 to 5,000. 2 in Virginia, the number dropped from 147,000 to 21,000. 403 Mississippi's Constitutional Convention cut Black voter enrollment from about 147,000 to around 8,600. 404. 1906, 5 years after Alabama designed its exclusionary rules, only 2% of Black voters remained on the state's voter registries. In 5 with the suppression of Black votes, Black representation in Congress quickly dwindled. During Reconstruction, 16 Black men held seats in Congress. 106 from 1887 to 1901, just 5 members of Congress, in either the House of Representatives and Senate, were Black. 107 from 1901 to 1929, not a single African American served in Congress. 408 no Black congressman would be elected again from the South until the 1970s. 409 barriers prevented African Americans from governing, while securing the power of Southern white supremacists in Congress, who voted down civil rights legislation and embedded racism into federal laws that built modern America. At the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s, white Southerners formed the Southern. In the Senate, a unified front of white Democratic senators from the former Confederate states. After the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, progressive senators proposed hundreds of pieces of civil rights legislation to remedy discrimination against African Americans in education, employment, housing, transportation, public accommodations, and voting. 111, but for 87 years, every attempt but one died in Congress, many blocked by the white Southern bloc of the Senate, who vigilantly thwarted any effort to advance Black civil rights. 412. Virginia senator explained, these restrictions were meant to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action under the limitations of the federal Constitution, with a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of, legally, without impairing the numerical strength of the white electorate. Did white Southern lawmakers vote down civil rights legislation, they also rewrote watershed pieces of legislation to exclude African Americans. Historians and economists consider the New Deal responsible for creating the modern middle class and many of the programs that Americans depend upon today, such as Social Security. 113, but the New Deal excluded African Americans from many of its benefits. 414 at the time, 90% of the Southern Black workforce, and 60% of nation's total Black workforce, worked as farm laborers or domestic servants. 415. Legislative process to pass various parts of the New Deal, Southerners on the Senate Finance Committee excluded farm laborers and domestic servants from programs providing Social Security, minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation. 116. As several historians explain, the exclusion of farm laborers and domestic servants was racially coded. Politicians, reported one architect of the new law, were determined to block any entering wedge for federal interference with the handling of the Negro question. 17. Thus, Southern politicians rewrote the New Deal to exclude African Americans from its benefits, fearing that federal benefits would discourage black workers from taking low-paying jobs in their fields, factories, and kitchens. 418. Final parts of the New Deal, the government spent $95 billion in the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 44 GI Bill to give millions of veterans returning from World War II the ability to attend college, receive job training, start businesses, and purchase homes. 19. Yet, one report from the 1940s observed that it was as though the GI Bill had been earmarked for white veterans only. 420. The chair of the House Veterans Committee, a white supremacist congressman from Mississippi, ensured that the GI Bill was administered by states instead of the federal government to guarantee that states could direct its funds solely to white veterans. 421. Similar results arose in housing and health care. Both the Hill-Burton Act, which underwrote the creation of a modern healthcare infrastructure, 422, and the Housing Act of 1949, Congress included segregation clauses or rejected anti-discrimination clauses to avoid Southern lawmakers' opposition, would have doomed the legislation. 423. By barring black political participation after Reconstruction, white supremacists seized state, local, and federal power, perpetuated discriminatory policies, blocked efforts to address discrimination, excluded African Americans from most of the major economic legislation that produced the modern economy of the United States. 424. To the Voting Rights Act. Passage of the Voting Rights Act, black voters have been among the most stable voting blocs, despite historic and ongoing efforts to restrict their ability to vote. 125. Black support has proved critical, in particular, in modern elections. In the last 3 presidential elections, black voter turnout was 67% in 2012, 60% in 2016, and 63% in 2020. In 26, black voter turnout in each of these elections was higher than Latino and Asian Americans, and higher than whites in 2012. 27. Though African Americans represent about 12.4% of the U.S. population today, 428. Many political pundits recognized that the black electorate played a significant role in determining the outcome in the presidential election in 2020. 429. These long-standing limitations on black political participation have deeply shaped the lives of African Americans. Goal of political participation is to ensure a government is responsive to the needs of its citizens. Black political participation is particularly important to serve the needs of black communities who experience the persisting effects of slavery and segregation. Suppression of black political participation has prevented African Americans from exercising their democratic voice, perpetuating policies that entrench racial inequalities. Americans gain greater representation, African Americans have a greater ability to request and enact policies that meet their economic and educational needs. Study, the first to examine the effects of black politicians on public finances during Reconstruction, found that Reconstruction-era communities with more black politicians had higher local tax revenue, as well as higher black literacy rates. 130. In other words, the study suggests that communities with more black politicians increased their tax revenue, which in turn increased investment in local education and black education. Study found that the passage of the Voting Rights Act led to some reduction in racial wealth disparities, especially in covered jurisdictions subject to greater federal oversight. 31. Comparing neighboring counties, where one county was a covered jurisdiction subject to heightened oversight under the Voting Rights Act and the other was not, the study found that the Voting Rights Act narrowed the black-white wage gap 5% between 1965 and 1970, a change driven primarily by increases in black wages. 432. Protecting black voting rights, the act helped drive increases in wages by giving African Americans greater voice to seek public employment opportunities and enabling African Americans to ask for public funds to be invested in their communities. 433. The act also allowed black communities and their representatives to implement affirmative action and anti-discrimination laws to protect African Americans and their ability to access equal employment opportunities and equal wages. 434. According Study, the Voting Rights Act contributed to about 1/5 of the overall decline in the wage gap between black and white Americans in the South between 1965 and 1970. 435. African Americans can secure the benefits of political participation only to the extent that government policies respond to their voices. Modern gains in political participation and representation, including Barack Obama, the first black man to be elected president in 2008, and Kamala Harris, first black woman to be elected vice president in 2020, African Americans have not seen a similar rise in policies responsive to their needs. 436. Examining more recent years have shown that not only do African Americans hold less political sway than white Americans when it comes to influencing black support for a policy actually decreases the chances that the government will enact it. 437 scholars have found evidence that members of Congress are less responsive to their black voters than to their white voters. 438. Events underscore the government's failures to heed black voices. For example, despite national and bipartisan support for police reform following the murder of George Floyd, Congress failed to enact any police reform legislation. 139. Similarly, Congress failed to pass any voting rights legislation, including bills with bipartisan support, to counteract the slew of state laws increasing voting restrictions after the 2020 election. 440. Congress has consistently failed to pass legislation redressing the economic disparities faced by African Americans. African American households, on average, still earn 1/10 that of white households. 41. Chapter 13. The Wealth Gap delves into the wealth gap between black and white families and its causes. Many of these problems can be traced to the discriminatory laws and policies that continue to be felt today. For example, housing segregation. Laws that historically enforced or sanctioned racial housing segregation have produced neighborhood segregation that persists today. 442. Because modern life revolves around families, including access to employment, credit scores, housing values, the amount of funding for local schools or parks, and policing, the racist policies that produce neighborhood segregation have created a discriminatory foundation upon which other laws have been built. 443. Increased political representation can allow black communities to try to change these systems. Undoing these discriminatory systems is not a matter of flipping a switch. Discriminatory policies have piled over decades and centuries, and undoing these systems is much like undoing the literal concrete underlying a city and its streets and sidewalks. 144. It requires many years, if not decades, of durable and long-term commitment to both change the old system and design a new one. The sustained, long-term commitment required for change means that the election of any one or several black is not enough to fix the problematic policies at the root of racial inequalities. 145. Political participation therefore represents just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to identifying the ongoing legacies of slavery, systemic discrimination, and what needs to be done to redress them. Black support for a policy actually decreases the chances that the government will enact it. Scholars have found evidence that members of Congress are less responsive to their black voters than to their white voters. California's early history, black Californians struggled to gain representation in political office or to have a voice in party politics. Beginning in 1870, most black Californians belonged to the Republican Party, the party that had abolished slavery. 146, but the white members of California's Republican Party ignored black Californians' requests to serve in elected or appointed political offices. 447. Some black voters protested by joining the Democratic Party in the 1880s. 448. But Democrats, too, refused black the offices that they had promised in order to lure black voters to their side. 149. Though black men secured the formal right to vote in 1870, it would take nearly a half-century before California's first black legislator, Frederick M. Roberts, was elected to the California State Assembly in 1918. 450. From 1918 to 1965, only 6 Californians were elected to the California legislature. 451. California did not elect its first black female legislator, Yvonne Brathwaite Burke, until 1966. 452. More recent years, California has made many strides in expanding voting rights access. As of January 2022, the number of black elected officials in California's legislature is now proportional to the state's black population. 53. But as described in later chapters of this report, the state still has not addressed many of the socioeconomic disparities that have resulted from these. Ending barriers, disparities that profoundly shape the lives of Black Californians. Californians may have a greater ability to vote in the ballot box today. Black Californians also have voted with their feet. Many have left the state for opportunities elsewhere, reflecting continued failure to address their needs. 454. 7. Conclusion. The promise of American democracy, the United States has excluded African Americans from equal participation in self-government. So, government officials and private parties sought to recreate the racial hierarchy that existed during enslavement. African Americans organized to pursue their equal citizenship. Government officials resisted, retaliated, and undercut Black political power through the many means described in this chapter. Many of these methods persisted for nearly a century, others persist to this day. These methods have limited the country's efforts to redress the legacy of slavery and racial discrimination, producing deep inequalities in the politics and policies that shape America and the lives of African Americans today. Policies have piled over decades and centuries, and undoing these systems is much like undoing the literal concrete underlying a city and its streets and sidewalks. Requires many, if not decades, of durable and long-term commitment to both change the old system and design a new one.